what is BDS, right? What is BDS? For those of you who don't know what it is, BDS is its initials that stand for boycott, divest, and sanctions. And it is a movement that was begun by people who were in what they call the Palestinian anti-normalization camp. One of the co-founders of the BDS movement is a fellow named Omar Barghouti. He's actually under indictment in Israel for evading taxes of about $700,000 currently. He actually lives in Israel. He was born in Kuwait. He grew up in Egypt. Then he married an Israeli Arab woman and moved to Israel, where he lives in Akko. He went to Tel Aviv University, where he got his undergraduate degree and graduate degrees and PhD. Just so you know, the BDS movement is about as intellectually honest as it is for its founder, all right, who calls himself a Palestinian Arab, and is fully happy availing himself of all the benefits of Israeli citizenship, and spent his entire life until he married an Israeli Arab woman, a citizen, living outside of Israel, and now is in Israel and gets his degrees from Tel Aviv University. Separate issue, but just understand what you're dealing with. So I'm going to read you so you understand what BDS calls itself, and then I'll tell you what it really is. BDS, according to Barghouti, is a nonviolent human rights movement that seeks freedom, justice, and equality for the Palestinian people based on international law and universal principles of human rights. As such, BDS has consistently and categorically rejected all forms of discrimination and racism, including anti-Semitism, as well as dozens of racist laws in Israel. And by the way, that last little piece kind of is the tip-off as to what they're about, because we all know there are no racist laws in Israel, right? In Israel, we have Arabs who sit on the Supreme Court, who are ministers in the Knesset, in the parliament, who are winners of beauty pageants, who work and live freely in all areas of life in the country, right? So that kind of gives it away. But it's very important to listen to the words that they're using, because what BDS actually is, it's the wolf of anti-Semitism that clothes itself in the sheep's clothing of human rights language to try and insinuate itself into people who are concerned with human rights and pervert their way of thinking so that what they attack is the only free country in the region, the only country that guarantees human rights as we all understand them to all of its inhabitants, regardless of their race, their religion, their sexual preference, their ethnicity, whatever they identify themselves with, right? So understand what we're talking about. You have to divide the BDS people in two, right? There are the people like Barghouti who see this as a way to ultimately cut the legs out from under the Jewish state till it collapses. And then you have those useful idiots out there in the world, and I'm not calling them idiots in the sense of idiots. I'm calling them useful idiots in the sense of useful idiots, right? Everyone is familiar with that term. It means people who, out of well-meaningness or not, are allowing themselves to be used to pursue an agenda that is actually diametrically opposed to what they think they're pursuing. Those useful idiots are particularly dangerous because there are a lot more of them potentially than there are of the people who are really trying to destroy Israel. BDS advocates have short-term and long-term goals. They have covert and overt goals. Their overt and short-term goal is ostensibly to get people to divest from Israel, to get people to boycott Israel, to get sanctions enacted on Israel like they were against apartheid South Africa once upon a time, which then led to the downfall of the South African apartheid regime, right? So that's their overt goal on which they have been wildly unsuccessful. BDS resolutions have failed when almost every single time they've sought to get them passed, and where they actually have passed, they haven't withstood legal challenges, not just in the United States, but around the world. Because when they're held up to the light, right, which is the greatest disinfectant, what's really going on and what's driving them is clear to everyone, and they tend to fall away. But they have a covert goal, a long-term goal as well, which is the more they talk about Israel in the same sentence with apartheid South Africa, the more they can even get this referendum kind of way of thinking within the conversation, they keep trying to chip away at the legitimacy of Israel as a country. The only country in the world, right, that is a sovereign country of the Jewish people. And at that, they potentially can be more successful, and it is up to us to stop it. And how do you stop it? You stop it by making freedom-loving people, not the way they use those terms, but the way those terms actually mean, stand up and take moral stances, speak out and reject that kind of big lie. And you do it by getting governments that respect freedom and democracy to enact laws to enshrine the protections for freedom and democracy and take principled stances as a government. And to understand how upside down the thinking is, I brought some statistics. Last year we talked about this, and I encouraged people, and I'll do it again, to check out. There is a non-governmental organization, an NGO that's based in Washington called freedomhouse.org. What Freedom House does, so you understand, is they have a ranking that goes from 0 on the low end, which is the least free, to 100 on the high end, which is the most free. And they give each country a ranking based on certain objective information and criteria that they've developed over the years to determine whether Israel, or any other country for that matter, is free. And they rank them in terms of freedom based on those numbers, and they also give a separate ranking for press freedoms. In the Middle East and North Africa, according to Freedom House, where it ranks countries in terms of that, on that 0 to 100 scale, there are only 2 countries that it considers free, Tunisia and Israel has the highest ranking. Israel's ranking is 80, Tunisia is 78. Every other country in the region or territory in the region is actually not free. In fact, the single worst country in the world for human rights and freedom is in that area. Can anyone guess what it is? Syria. You know what Syria's ranking on the 0 to 100 scale is in Freedom House? -1. -1. But it includes some of the worst and lowest grades in the world, including Syria at -1, Saudi Arabia at 10, Libya 13, Bahrain 12, and of course that bastion of freedom, Iran, which is 17. By the way, for comparison's sake, so you understand what we're talking about, Turkey, which is a member of NATO and actually isn't in the Freedom House regions, is not in the Middle East and North Africa. Turkey scores a 38 and is partly free only. So you understand what we're talking about. The obvious question is, where is the BDS movement against Turkey? Where is the BDS movement against Saudi Arabia? Where is the BDS movement against Bahrain, against Iran? So, ask yourselves those questions if you want to understand what is really driving the BDS movement. In fact, Barghouti has never hidden what he says it is. He's against a two-state solution. He is against peace with Israel. In fact, for any ground level, right, grassroots connections between Israelis and the Arabs who live in the country, whether in the territories or in Israel themselves, Barghouti has mercilessly criticized them in the press, saying that they were terrible people and that they shouldn't be doing it and they were politically short-sighted. What the BDS people want and what the BDS supporters want is one state. And the one state they want will not be Jewish. They want to get rid of the single Jewish state in the world. The ultimate irony is that the freest ethnic Arabs in the world live in Israel. So, what do we do about it? Well, you have to stand up and you have to address the BDS supporters when they're out there, and there's a way to do that. And by the way, that includes their hangers-on and the people who promote their agenda, like the Students for Justice in Palestine, right? By the way, you'll note, if you look at the studies, there's an uptick in anti-Semitic incidents at every single campus in this country where there's an active SJP membership group. There's a reason for that, because the two go hand in hand. Even they cannot separate out the anti-Semitism from the BDS anti-Israel stuff. Now, by the way, we're not about stifling criticism of Israel, and we're not saying Israel is a perfect country. Okay? Even Freedom House hasn't identified a perfect country yet, and I doubt anyone here can. The issue is, do you single out for opprobrium? Do you single out for boycott, divest, and sanctions a bastion of freedom in a region in the world where there is none, and try and destroy that country, which is really what the BDS movement is about, right? Or do you say, we'll work within that country to try and continue to get it to improve, and work on the really bad folks who are out there? So the U.S. law recognizes this thing called the disparate impact test, where we look to see if there's racism or sexism by seeing, how it actually works in the world. What are people actually doing? Ask yourselves and ask your representatives and your members of Congress whether these fall within those categories. Years ago, Natan Sharansky, and by the way, this definition was adopted by the U.S. State Department and used for quite a while, came up with what he called his 3D definition of how you can tell whether criticism of Israel was legitimate criticism or whether it went over the line. And the 3 Ds are demonization, delegitimization, and the last one was, you want to help me out? Do you remember it? But we'll get it in a minute. But let's go down. BDS falls within the category it satisfies all 3 Ds. What? Double standards. Double standards, okay? So I was just talking to you about double standards, right? Because we have the world of BDS tries to hold the Jewish state to standards and conduct that it would never dream of applying to any other country in the world. Think about it, right? Demonization. BDS constantly uses Nazi imagery and demonization imagery, which really are anti-Semitic. Look at any cartoons of the PA. Look at the language that's used by Barghouti. He constantly calls Israelis Nazis. And delegitimization. They expressly say what they're trying to do is get the rest of the world to believe as they do that Israel has no legitimate rights to be its own state. In other words, they deny the Jewish people the right for self-determination and legitimacy as a state. That's all 3 of those areas are where they cross the line from legitimate criticism of Israel or any other democratic country and become anti-Semitism. So think about what boycotts are, right? The Nazi persecution of Jews in Germany began with a boycott of Jewish businesses. Turned out the Germans didn't plan it very well because they started it on a Saturday, so most of the Jewish businesses were closed. But it proceeded from there. What we have to fight against here is the first step down the slippery slope, right? Because if we don't work to arrest it at the first step, who knows where it may lead.